Hello, and welcome to today's Human Rights Lecture. Today we're going to be talking about human rights and the coronavirus. As you know, the coronavirus has been spreading quickly around the world. Different countries have taken steps to stop the spread of the virus. Today we will talk about some actions taken by various countries and whether these actions impinge on the human rights of their citizens. So the key question we're discussing today is, when does public safety outweigh human rights? And there are associated questions with this, such as who decides what the balance is, and does that decision depend on political beliefs, or is the decision guided by the public good? Okay, so today we'll talk about the coronavirus outbreak. We'll start by talking about the Chinese response to the outbreak. Then we'll turn to the Australian response to the outbreak. And we will discuss what human rights may have been breached or are being breached by imposition of things like quarantine and restriction of movement and the closure of businesses. We will try and relate these human rights breaches to articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then finally, we'll talk about how can you balance human rights and public safety. And after that, I will give you a task for you to complete. So this is basically how the coronavirus appeared. On December 31st, 2019, the Chinese government reported some strange pneumonia cases, which were centered in the province of Hubei, particularly in the city of Wuhan. It is believed that they were contracted from a wet market, particularly from bats, although this hasn't really been confirmed yet. On January 11th, the Chinese government announced its first death from this new virus. And on February 2nd, the first death outside China was recorded in the Philippines. On February 11th, the WHO, the World Health Organization, a UN organization, named the virus COVID-19. 19 is for the year it appeared, 2019. So we're going to talk about the case of Dr. Li Wenliang from China. Dr. Li was one of the first people to report the virus. He's a doctor in Wuhan, in Hubei, in China. He reported a new virus was presenting in his hospital and was concerned about its impact. He reported this to fellow doctors in the area. However, the Chinese government accused Dr. Li of spreading false rumours. They sent some security guards to him at his home, and they forced him to sign a confession saying that he was spreading false rumours and causing panic in the community. Unfortunately, Dr. Li eventually contracted the virus, but he continued to conduct online interviews from his hospital bed. Dr. Li died in February, leaving behind his wife and young child. Many people consider Dr. Li to be a hero because he spoke out despite the fact the Chinese government was trying to censor the news. The question in Dr. Li's case is, was he deprived of his human rights by the Chinese government, and which human rights was he deprived of? As the virus started to spread around the world, it eventually came to Australia. On the 25th of January 2020, Australia had its first case of coronavirus diagnosed. And on the 29th, the Australian government imposed a 14-day quarantine period on people arriving from Hubei in China. On the 1st of February, all foreign travellers from China were banned from Australia, while citizens and residents who returned from China had to be quarantined for 14 days. Many people said that this was a xenophobic response to the crisis. On the 29th of February, the ban on travellers was extended to arrivals from Iran. On the 13th of March, the Australian government banned gatherings of more than 500 people in the community in efforts to stop the spread of the virus. And on the 20th of March, the Australian border was closed to all non-residents and non-citizens, meaning that nobody who was a foreigner and travelling from overseas could enter Australia. On March 23rd, 2020, the Australian government introduced the most stringent restrictions yet. They closed all places where people could gather. This was a reaction to footage from the beaches in Sydney from the weekend, where thousands of people had gathered together and totally ignored government advice about social distancing, that is, keeping apart more than 1.5 metres. So in a response to this, the government announced that it was closing places of social gathering because of the virus. The places they closed include pubs, clubs and bars, cinemas, restaurants and cafes, and many other places like gyms, for example. This resulted in thousands of people losing their jobs almost immediately, and major lines started to form around Centrelink offices around the nation, Centrelink being where unemployment benefits are administered. Now, there are obvious human rights implications to imposing restrictions on the population. And when the United Nations drafted human rights documents, they anticipated that there would be cases where human rights have to be limited for the sake of public welfare. So basically, the human rights documents state that human rights can be limited where there are public safety, security or health implications. But the question comes up that how do you balance the human rights and the public interest, and how much power do you give governments to restrict human rights, and how long do those powers actually exist? Now, Amnesty International has already published a document discussing the issues of human rights and the coronavirus and the various restrictions that governments have been imposing. Amnesty suggests that certain measures taken by governments in relationship to the virus are threatening human rights. For example, the imposition of quarantine impinges on the right to free movement. Shutting businesses infringes on the right to work. There are also issues regarding the right to healthcare, in particular who has access to healthcare. For example, in the early days of the coronavirus outbreak in the United States, it seemed that people who were famous, people who were celebrities, were getting easier access to COVID-19 testing than average people. I have attached a copy of the Amnesty document to this lesson. In summary, the key issue is how much power do we allow governments to exercise during a public health crisis? And does this power infringe upon people's human rights? There are other questions, of course, about how long do we give the governments these powers, and How do we take these powers back once we've actually given it to them? For example, restrictions on people's freedom of movement. The government may decide, well, we'll just keep those going to maintain public order, even when the health crisis is over. So the key question we're thinking about here today is, how do you balance human rights with public welfare? So in light of these questions and the small bit of information I've given you today, I'd like you to consider, is the Australian response to the coronavirus impinging on human rights? And do you feel like your human rights are being breached? You can include which articles of the UDHR do you think are being breached by the government's imposition of restrictions and limitations. So I'd like you to write about between 100 and 200 words on this issue. Tell me what you think. And you can email it to me, or you can post it on the forum on Moodle. Thanks for listening. Keep safe, and remember, while you're keeping safe, remember human rights as well. See you next week.